The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Daniel pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway. It was almost midnight and the office building was finally quiet. His reflection caught in the glass windows, a tired man in a blue janitor's uniform, moving from room to room like a ghost. Nobody noticed during the day. 3 years. That's how long he'd been working the night shift at Harrington Tech headquarters. 3 years of mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and wiping down desks while everyone else was home with their families. But Daniel couldn't complain. This job put food on the table. It kept a roof over his head and his daughter's head. That's all that mattered. He was 42 years old, though some days he felt much older. His hands were rough and calloused now, nothing like they used to be. His back ached by the end of every shift from bending over and lifting heavy garbage bags. But when he got home each morning and saw his little girl sleeping peacefully in her bed, every sore muscle felt worth it. Life hadn't always been this way. Daniel used to have different dreams, bigger plans. But that was a long time ago, in what felt like another lifetime. Now he was just trying to get through each day, one shift at a time. His daughter Lucy was 8 years old, with bright eyes and a smile that could light up any room. She was the reason he kept going, the reason he worked these long nights without complaint. Her mother had left when Lucy was just 2 years old. One day she was there and the next day she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty closet and a note saying she couldn't do this anymore. So Daniel had figured it out on his own. He'd learned how to braid hair by watching videos on his phone. He'd mastered making lunchboxes that other kids wouldn't laugh at. He'd become both mom and dad, all while working whatever jobs he could find that would pay the bills. The janitor position wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And steady was something he desperately needed. The building he worked in was impressive, all glass and steel and modern design. The lobby had marble floors that he polished until they gleamed. The executives who worked here made more money in a month than Daniel made in a year. They walked past him every evening as he started his shift, barely seeing him. To them, he was just part of the furniture, as invisible as the potted plants in the corners. But Daniel didn't mind being invisible. He'd gotten used to it. Besides, he had bigger things to worry about than whether people noticed him. Like how Lucy needed new shoes because she'd outgrown her old ones, or how the rent was going up next month, or how she'd asked him yesterday if they could get a piano, and he'd had to pretend he didn't hear the question because saying no would break both their hearts. The main atrium of the building was Daniel's favorite place to clean. It was a huge open space with a glass ceiling that let you see the stars on clear nights, and right in the center of it all sat a beautiful grand piano. It was black and shiny, imported from somewhere in Europe according to the plaque on it. The CEO had bought it himself, apparently. Some fancy instrument that cost more than Daniel would make in 5 years. Every week, Daniel dusted that piano carefully, running his cloth along its smooth surface. He was always gentle with it, treating it like the treasure it was. Sometimes, when he was sure nobody was around, he would stop and just look at it. His fingers would twitch slightly, remembering. Always remembering. 20 years ago, Daniel had been someone completely different. He'd been a music student at one of the best schools in the country, studying piano performance. He'd practiced 8 hours a day. His teachers had said he had real talent, that he could have a future as a performer. He'd dreamed of concert halls and recordings, of making a living doing what he loved most in the world. But then his father got sick. Really sick. Cancer, the doctor said, and it was bad. Someone needed to take care of him, and Daniel was an only child. His mother had passed away years before. So Daniel made a choice. He dropped out of school and moved back home to take care of his dad. The medical bills piled up fast. Insurance didn't cover everything, and the treatments were expensive. Daniel took whatever work he could find, construction, retail, restaurants, anything that would pay. He sold his piano to help cover costs. The money from his college fund disappeared into hospital payments. And through it all, he sat by his father's bedside, watching the man who'd raised him slowly fade away. His father died 2 years later. By then, Daniel was drowning in debt. The scholarship he'd had was gone. Going back to music school wasn't an option anymore. That door had closed, and there was no reopening it. So he'd kept working regular jobs, eventually meeting Lucy's mother, thinking maybe he could build a different kind of life. But now that was gone too. And here he was, mopping floors in a building with a piano he'd never play, living a life so far from his dreams that sometimes it felt like those years at music school had happened to someone else entirely. Daniel finished cleaning the executive offices and made his way back down to the atrium. It was late, past 1 in the morning now. The building should have been completely empty, but as he approached, he heard voices. Laughter. The sound of people who'd had a bit too much to drink. He slowed his cart, not wanting to interrupt. A group of young executives were gathered near the piano, ties loosened, drinks in hand. They must have stayed late after some office party. Daniel recognized a few of them. People who worked on the upper floors. The ones who got driven to work in nice cars and wore watches that cost more than his monthly salary. One of them, a guy named Brad who was related to someone important in the company, noticed Daniel approaching with his cleaning supplies. Brad was known around the building for being arrogant, the type who'd gotten his position through family connections rather than hard work. "Hey, janitor guy," Brad called out, his words slightly slurred. His friends turned to look. "Come here for a second." Daniel wanted to pretend he hadn't heard, to just keep moving and finish his work. But he couldn't. These were executives, people who could get him fired if they wanted to. So he stopped his cart and walked over, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, sir? Is there something you need?" Brad grinned, and Daniel immediately knew this wasn't going to be good. He'd seen that look before. The look of someone who'd decided to have fun at someone else's expense. "We were just talking about this piano," Brad said, gesturing dramatically at the instrument behind him. "Beautiful thing, isn't it? Costs a fortune. But here's the thing, nobody ever plays it. It just sits here looking pretty." He paused and his grin widened. "So I've got a question for you. Can you play piano?" Daniel's heart started beating faster. The other executives were watching now, anticipating entertainment. He could see where this was going, could feel the trap being set. "Not really, sir," Daniel said quietly, which wasn't exactly a lie. He hadn't touched a piano in years. "Come on," Brad pushed, encouraged by his friend's laughter. "I bet you can't even play chopsticks, am I right?" More laughter from the group. "Tell you what, sit down and play us something. Unless you're too scared." Daniel stood there, holding his cleaning cloth, feeling the weight of the moment. Every instinct told him to refuse politely and walk away. Nothing good could come from this. But something else stirred inside him. Something he'd kept buried for a very long time. A small voice asking, "What if?" Daniel felt his face getting hot, but not from anger. It was something else entirely. Something that had been sleeping inside him for 20 years was suddenly waking up. He thought about Lucy, about how she'd asked him that morning why they couldn't get a piano. He'd seen the disappointment in her eyes when he changed the subject. He thought about all those hours he'd spent practicing when he was young. All those dreams he'd carefully folded up and put away like old photographs. He thought about his father, who used to sit in the audience at his recitals with tears of pride in his eyes. And he thought about this moment right now where a group of drunk executives thought they'd found easy entertainment in making fun of the janitor. The old Daniel would have walked away, the Daniel who'd learned to be invisible, who'd accepted his place in the world, who knew better than to make waves. But something shifted in that moment. Maybe it was exhaustion from 3 years of being nobody. Maybe it was the memory of his daughter's question. Or maybe it was just that he was tired of hiding the biggest part of himself. He set down his cleaning cloth on top of his cart. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll play something." Brad's eyebrows shot up. He clearly hadn't expected that. His friends exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable now. Maybe they were starting to realize this wasn't as funny as they'd thought. But Brad was in too deep to back down now. "Well, look at that." The janitor's got some confidence. "This should be good." Daniel walked slowly toward the piano. Each step felt strange, like walking toward a door he'd locked years ago. His uniform felt wrong next to the elegant instrument. The piano gleamed under the atrium lights, perfect and pristine. He'd cleaned around it hundreds of times, but he'd never let himself imagine actually playing it. He sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly, muscle memory taking over. The other executives had gone quiet now, watching with curious expressions. Some of them were smiling, waiting for the joke to reach its punchline. Others looked uncertain, like they were starting to sense this might go differently than Brad had planned. Daniel looked down at the keys. They were ivory and ebony, perfectly maintained. His hands hovered over them, and he noticed how different they looked now. Rough skin, calloused fingers, small scars from years of manual labor. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist anymore. but maybe, just maybe, they still remembered. He took a deep breath and let his fingers touch the keys. Then he began to play, not chopsticks, not some simple tune. He played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and complex pieces ever written. It was the piece that had earned him his scholarship all those years ago. The piece he'd performed when his teachers told him he had a real future in music. The piece he'd played the night before his father was diagnosed, before everything changed. The first notes rang out across the atrium, clear and pure. Daniel closed his eyes, and suddenly he wasn't in an office building wearing a janitor's uniform. He was 22 again, sitting in a concert hall playing for an audience that held its breath. His fingers moved across the keys like they'd been waiting for this moment, like they'd been practicing in secret all these years. The music poured out of him. Every feeling he'd been holding back came through in those notes. The sadness of dreams abandoned, the loneliness of raising a child alone, the quiet desperation of working nights while everyone else slept, the love he felt for his daughter that made all the sacrifice worth it, the memory of his father who'd believed in him until the very end. All of it flowed through his fingers into the piano. Behind him, the laughter had died completely. The executives stood frozen, their smiles gone. A security guard who'd been making his rounds stopped in the hallway, drawn by the music. Another janitor, someone Daniel worked with on the night shift, put down her mop and stood listening. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Daniel played with his eyes closed, traveling back through time. He remembered his teacher at music school, Professor Chen, who told him he had rare talent. He remembered his first public performance, how his hands had shaken but then steadied when he touched the keys. He remembered his father sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. He remembered all the hours of practice, the calluses on his fingers from different work, the work of making music instead of cleaning up after other people. The piece had moments of incredible softness, notes so gentle they were almost whispers. Then it would swell into something bigger, more powerful. Daniel's fingers danced across the keys, executing runs and trills that took years to master. His whole body moved with the music, swaying slightly, completely lost in the performance. One of the executives, a woman named Jennifer, felt tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't even know why. There was just something about the music, about watching this man in a janitor's uniform play with such emotion, that reached something deep inside her. She glanced at Brad, who was standing completely still, his earlier swagger gone. He looked like he'd been slapped. The music built to its final crescendo, then slowly, gently came back down to earth. The last notes hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. Daniel held the final chord, letting it fade naturally into silence. Then he lifted his hands from the keys and opened his eyes. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was complete. Daniel sat there, breathing heavily, feeling like he'd just run a marathon. His heart was pounding. He couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. After all these years, after all the time spent pretending that part of him didn't exist, he'd let it out. And it had felt incredible. Slowly, Daniel turned around on the bench. The faces looking back at him were nothing like they'd been before. Brad's mouth was slightly open, speechless for maybe the first time in his life. The other executives looked shocked, some of them visibly moved. The security guard in the hallway started clapping, slow and steady. The other janitor joined in. Daniel stood up, suddenly embarrassed. What had he been thinking? These people hadn't asked for a concert. They'd asked for entertainment, for a joke. He'd taken it seriously, let himself be vulnerable in front of people who probably still saw him as just the janitor. Nothing had changed, not really. He'd still go home to his small apartment. He'd still have to tell Lucy they couldn't afford a piano. He'd still be invisible tomorrow night. I should get back to work, Daniel said quietly, moving toward his cart. Sorry for the disruption. Wait. The voice came from somewhere behind the group, deep and commanding. Everyone turned. A man was standing on the mezzanine level above them, one hand on the railing. He was older, maybe 70, wearing an expensive suit even though it was the middle of the night. His face was wet with tears that he wasn't bothering to hide. Daniel recognized him immediately and his stomach dropped. It was Richard Harrington, the CEO, the owner of the company, the man who'd bought that piano, the man who could fire Daniel with a single word. Richard started walking down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silent atrium. Everyone watched him, tension crackling in the air. Brad had gone pale. He clearly hadn't known the CEO was in the building. None of them had. Richard reached the bottom of the stairs and walked straight to Daniel, ignoring everyone else. Up close, Daniel could see the tears on the older man's face more clearly. Richard's eyes were red, but there was something in them. Not anger, but something else Daniel couldn't quite identify. "How long?" Richard asked, his voice rough with emotion. "How long have you been able to play like that?" Daniel didn't know what to say. His mind was racing. Was this it? Was he about to lose his job? I studied music a long time ago, sir. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched the piano. It won't happen again." Richard shook his head slowly, still wiping his eyes. "Don't apologize. Please don't apologize." He turned to Brad and the other executives, and when he spoke, his voice was cold. "All of you need to leave now. Go home. And tomorrow we're going to have a very long conversation about respect." Brad and his friends practically ran for the exit, their faces burning with shame. Jennifer lingered for just a moment, giving Daniel a small, apologetic smile before she left. The security guard and the other janitor quietly slipped away too, sensing this was a private moment. When everyone was gone, Richard turned back to Daniel. "Please," he said, gesturing to a seating area nearby. "Sit with me. I want to hear your story." Daniel sat down on the leather couch, feeling completely out of place. The furniture in this seating area probably cost more than everything he owned. Richard Harrington sat across from him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The CEO was still wiping his eyes, not embarrassed by his tears at all. Daniel had never seen someone so successful look so vulnerable. "I need to know," Richard finally said. "Where did you learn to play like that? That wasn't something you picked up from watching videos. That was real training. Years of it." Daniel hesitated. He'd spent 3 years in this building keeping his head down, staying invisible. Now here he was, sitting with the CEO at 1 a.m, about to tell his story. Part of him still wanted to make up an excuse and go back to mopping floors. But another part, the part that had just played that piano, was tired of hiding. "I went to Juilliard," Daniel said quietly. 20 years ago. I had a full scholarship for piano performance." Richard's eyes widened. "Juilliard? That's one of the best music schools in the world. I know. I was one of the lucky ones who got in. My teachers thought I had real potential. I practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. I loved every minute of it." Daniel paused, the memories washing over him. "I thought that was going to be my life. Performing, maybe teaching, doing something with music. I couldn't imagine anything else. What happened?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be painful. Daniel took a deep breath. "My dad got sick, cancer, stage 4. My mom had already passed away when I was younger. So it was just me and him. He needed someone to take care of him, and I was all he had." He looked down at his rough hands. "I dropped out in my 3rd year. Moved back home. The medical bills started piling up immediately. Insurance didn't cover half of what he needed." Richard nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "I took whatever jobs I could find to help pay for his treatment. Construction work, waiting tables, night shifts at warehouses, anything that paid. I sold my piano to help with the bills. Used up all my savings. The scholarship was gone, obviously. You can't just leave Juilliard for 2 years and expect to come back." Daniel's voice was steady, but there was an old pain underneath it. "He fought hard. We both did. But he died anyway. 2 years after the diagnosis. I'm sorry," Richard said, and he meant it. "By the time it was over, I was drowning in debt. Going back to school wasn't an option. That door had closed, and I'd made peace with it. I thought maybe I could build a different kind of life." Daniel smiled sadly. "Met a woman, got married, had a daughter. Lucy, she's 8 now. The best thing that ever happened to me." "And Lucy's mother?" Richard asked gently. "Left when Lucy was 2. Just walked out one day. I came home from work and she was gone. Took her stuff, left a note, and that was it." Daniel shrugged, though the gesture didn't quite hide the hurt. "So it's been just me and Lucy for 6 years now. I do my best. Some days are harder than others, but I'd do anything for that kid." Richard was quiet for a moment, absorbing the story. Then he said something that surprised Daniel. "I used to play piano too. When I was young," Daniel looked up. "Really? My mother taught me. She was a music teacher. I loved it, actually. Used to practice every day after school." Richard's expression grew distant. "But my father had different ideas. He said music was a hobby, not a career. Pushed me toward business school. Told me I needed to be practical, to think about my future, so I gave it up. Stopped playing. Went to business school like he wanted, got my MBA, started this company. You built something incredible, Daniel said. Harrington Tech is one of the biggest companies in the state. I did, Richard agreed. I made more money than my father ever dreamed of. Built this empire from nothing. Won awards, got written up in magazines. Success by every measure that matters to the world. He paused. But you know what? I can't remember the last time anything made me feel the way your music made me feel tonight. I can't remember the last time I cried. I can't remember the last time I felt anything at all, really. Just empty. The honesty in Richard's voice was startling. Here was one of the most successful men in the city admitting he felt empty. I'm 71 years old, Richard continued. My wife divorced me 15 years ago. Said I cared more about the company than her. She was right. My 2 kids are adults now and I barely know them. They're polite when they call, but there's no real connection there. I missed too many birthdays, too many school plays, too many moments that mattered. I was always working. Daniel listened, understanding more than Richard probably realized. Success and failure both came with prices. I bought that piano 5 years ago, Richard said, gesturing toward the instrument. Told myself it was for the lobby, to make the space more elegant. But really, I think I bought it because I missed playing. I thought maybe having it here would remind me of something I'd lost. Instead, it just sat there. I'd walk past it every day and feel nothing. Just another piece of expensive furniture. Until tonight, Daniel said. Until tonight, Richard agreed. I came back to get some files for a meeting. I was up in my office when I heard the music. At first, I thought someone had left a recording playing. But then I realized it was live. Someone was actually playing that piano, so I came down to see who it was. And you found me, Daniel said. And I found you, standing there in your uniform, playing with more passion than I've heard in any concert hall. Those kids making fun of you, not realizing they were in the presence of real talent. Real heart. Richard leaned forward. And then I saw you finish, saw you start to go back to your mop bucket like nothing had happened, like what you'd just done was ordinary. And something broke open inside me. The atrium was completely silent except for their voices. Outside the windows, the city lights twinkled in the darkness. Why are you telling me all this? Daniel asked. Richard smiled. Because I want to offer you something. Actually, 2 things. He stood up and started pacing, energy returning to his movements. First, we're having our annual gala next month. 500 people, investors, board members, important clients. Every year we hire some jazz band or string quartet. This year I want you to play. Daniel's heart started racing. Mr. Harrington, I don't think... Please call me Richard. And just hear me out. I want those 500 people to hear what I heard tonight. I want them to remember what real passion sounds like. What real talent looks like, even if it's wearing a janitor's uniform. I haven't performed in 20 years, Daniel protested, and I'd need to practice. I work nights and during the day I need to take care of Lucy. Which brings me to the second thing, Richard interrupted. I want to offer you a position in our employee development program. We have education benefits, tuition assistance, flexible scheduling. If you want to go back to school, finish your degree, study music again, we'll support it. You can work here during the day in a different role, something that pays better than night janitorial work and gives you time to be with your daughter. Daniel stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. Why would you do this for me? Because you reminded me of something I forgot, Richard said simply. You reminded me that success isn't just about money or power or building companies. It's about honoring the gifts we've been given. You have a gift, Daniel, a real one, and you buried it to take care of your father, to take care of your daughter. That's noble, but maybe it's time to let that gift breathe again. Daniel felt something cracking inside his chest. Hope, dangerous and terrifying. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Richard said. Say you'll come play at the gala. Say you'll let me help you find your way back to music. Not just for you, but for your daughter. What kind of example do you want to set for her? That dreams die? Or that it's never too late to reclaim them? Daniel thought about Lucy, about how she'd asked for a piano, about how he'd had to pretend he didn't hear because saying no hurt too much, about all the things he'd given up and all the reasons why, about the life he'd been living versus the life he'd once dreamed of. Okay, he said finally, his voice shaky. Okay, I'll do it. Richard smiled, really smiled for the first time. Good, that's good. We'll work out the details tomorrow. Come to my office at 9 in the morning. We'll talk about everything, the gala, the position, the education benefits. Bring Lucy if you need to. I'd love to meet her. Daniel barely slept that night. He kept replaying everything in his mind, wondering if it had really happened or if he'd imagined the whole thing. When his alarm went off at 7 in the morning, he'd only managed about 2 hours of sleep. But he didn't feel tired. He felt electric, alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. Lucy was already awake, sitting at their small kitchen table eating cereal and working on her homework. She looked up when he came out of his bedroom, her face brightening. "Daddy, you're home early. You're never home this early." "I know, sweetheart. Something happened at work last night." Daniel sat down across from her, trying to figure out how to explain. "Something good, I think. Maybe really good." "What happened?" Lucy asked, putting down her pencil. Daniel took a deep breath. "Remember how you asked me about getting a piano? And I kind of changed the subject?" Lucy's expression became guarded. She nodded but didn't say anything. Daniel could see she was preparing herself for disappointment again. "Well, last night at work, something crazy happened. There's this piano in the building, a really nice one. And some people asked me to play it. So I did." Lucy's eyes went wide. "You played a piano, but you always said you didn't know how?" "I know. I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you about that. The truth is, I used to play a lot. Before you were born. Before I met your mom. I was actually pretty good at it." Daniel reached across the table and took her small hand in his. "I studied music in college. That's what I wanted to do with my life. But then your grandpa got sick and I had to leave school to take care of him. After that, I stopped playing. I stopped thinking about music. It hurt too much to remember what I'd given up." Lucy was quiet for a moment, processing this. "So you really know how to play piano? Like really, really?" "Yeah, kiddo. Really, really? Can you teach me?" The hope in her voice nearly broke his heart. "Maybe better than that," Daniel said. "The man who owns the company where I work? His name is Richard. He heard me play last night and he was really impressed. He wants me to play at a big fancy event next month, and he's offering to help me go back to school to study music again. He's also giving me a better job, one where I work during the day instead of at night, which means I'll be home with you in the evenings." Lucy's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Really? You're not going to work nights anymore?" "Really. And we'll have more money, which means we can get you those new shoes you need. And maybe, just maybe, we can start looking at getting a keyboard for the apartment. Nothing fancy at first, but something you can practice on. Something I can teach you on." Lucy jumped up from her chair and threw her arms around his neck. "This is the best day ever." Daniel held her tight, feeling tears sting his eyes. "It might be, sweetheart. It just might be." 2 hours later, Daniel and Lucy walked into the Harrington Tech building together. Lucy wore her best dress, the one they saved for special occasions. She kept looking around at everything with wide eyes. The marble floors, the glass ceilings, the modern art on the walls. "This is where you work, Daddy? It's so fancy, I know it is. Kind of intimidating, right?" They took the elevator up to the executive floor. Daniel's heart was pounding. Part of him still expected to arrive at Richard's office and be told the whole thing had been a mistake, or a joke, or a dream. But when the secretary saw them, she smiled warmly. "Mr. Chen, and this must be Lucy. Mr. Harrington is expecting you. Go right in." Richard's office was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The CEO stood up from his desk when they entered, and Daniel was struck again by how kind his eyes were. This wasn't the intimidating businessman he'd imagined from a distance. This was just a man who'd been moved by music. "Daniel, thank you for coming." "And you must be Lucy." Richard came around his desk and knelt down to Lucy's level. "Your father is an incredibly talented man. Did you know that?" Lucy nodded shyly. "He just told me this morning." "I didn't know before. Well, now you know. And I hope you're proud of him, because I certainly am." Richard stood back up and gestured to some chairs. "Please sit. We have a lot to talk about." They spent the next hour going over details. Richard had already talked to the Human Resources Department. There was a position available in employee relations, helping to identify and support talent within the company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid twice what Daniel made as a janitor, with benefits and normal daytime hours. The education program would cover up to $20,000 a year in tuition costs. "I know you might not want to go back to Juilliard," Richard said. "That's understandable. But there's an excellent music program at the State University. You could finish your degree. Take your time with it. We'll work around your schedule. Daniel felt overwhelmed. I don't understand why you're doing all this for me. Richard was quiet for a moment, then he looked at Lucy. Do you mind if I tell your dad something personal? Lucy shook her head, curious. I have 2 children, Richard said, speaking to Daniel but keeping his eyes on Lucy. A son and a daughter, both adults now. When they were growing up, I was never around. Always working, always busy building this company. I missed their school plays. I missed their baseball games. I missed bedtime stories and helping with homework. I told myself I was doing it for them, to give them a better life. But really, I was just running away from the things that scared me. Connection, vulnerability, being present. He finally looked back at Daniel. Now they're grown and we barely know each other. They call on holidays. We have polite conversations. But there's no real relationship there, and that's my fault. I can't get those years back. Richard's voice grew thick with emotion. When I saw you last night, working nights so you could be there for your daughter during the day, sacrificing your dreams so she could have a stable life, it hit me hard. You're being the father I never was. And when you played that piano, I heard everything you'd given up. Everything you'd buried. And I thought, what if I could help? What if I could give you a chance to reclaim your dreams without having to sacrifice being a good father? Maybe that would mean something. Daniel didn't know what to say. Lucy reached over and took his hand. Plus, Richard added, his tone lightening, I'm being selfish too. I want to hear you play at that gala. I want to see the look on people's faces. I want them to remember that talent isn't always where you expect to find it. Sometimes it's mopping floors, invisible, waiting for someone to notice. They talked logistics after that. Daniel would start his new position in 2 weeks, giving him time to transition. The gala was 5 weeks away, which gave him time to practice. Richard was even arranging for Daniel to have access to the piano in the atrium during off hours, so he could prepare. There's one more thing, Richard said, as they were getting ready to leave. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Yes, it's Richard. Can you bring that package up to my office? Thank you. A few minutes later, the secretary came in carrying a large box. Richard took it and handed it to Lucy. This is for you. Lucy looked at her father, who nodded, then carefully opened the box. Inside was a beautiful digital keyboard. Not top of the line, but far nicer than anything Daniel could have afforded. Lucy gasped. Is this really for me? It's really for you, Richard said. Every musician needs an instrument to practice on. Your dad is going to need to practice for the gala, and I think you should practice with him. What do you say? Lucy threw her arms around Richard, taking him by surprise. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Richard's eyes got misty, and Daniel saw him gently pat Lucy's back. For a moment, the powerful CEO looked like he was remembering something precious he'd lost long ago. As they left the building, Lucy carrying her new keyboard, Daniel felt like he was walking through a dream. In the span of 12 hours, his entire life had changed. The impossible had become possible. The door he thought was closed forever had opened again. Daddy, Lucy said as they walked to the car. Yeah, sweetheart? I'm really proud of you. Daniel stopped walking and knelt down, pulling her into a hug right there on the sidewalk. I'm proud of you too, Lucy, and I promise I'm going to make the most of this chance. For both of us. That afternoon, they set up the keyboard in their small living room. Daniel sat down at it and Lucy sat beside him. His fingers touched the keys, and for the first time in 20 years, he began to teach someone else the thing he loved most in the world. His daughter watched with absolute attention, soaking up every word. And in that moment, Daniel realized that Richard had given him something even more valuable than a job or education benefits. He'd given him back his identity. He'd given him permission to be whole again. The next 5 weeks passed in a blur. Daniel started his new position in employee relations, and it felt strange to walk through the building during daylight hours, wearing business casual clothes instead of his janitor's uniform. His co-workers treated him differently now, actually seeing him for the first time. Some were kind. Others were confused about why the CEO had taken such a personal interest in a former janitor. Daniel tried not to pay attention to the whispers. Every evening after work, he'd go to the atrium and practice on the piano. Lucy would do her homework nearby, occasionally looking up to watch him play. Sometimes she'd join him on the bench and he'd teach her simple songs. Her face would light up when she got a melody right, and Daniel would feel a joy so pure it almost hurt. Richard stopped by sometimes to listen. He'd sit quietly in one of the chairs, eyes closed, just absorbing the music. Afterward, they'd talk. Really talk. About life, about regrets, about what mattered. A friendship was forming between them. Unlikely but genuine. Two men from completely different worlds connected by music and second chances. The night of the gala arrived faster than Daniel expected. He stood backstage in a rented tuxedo that Lucy had insisted made him look like a movie star. His hands were shaking. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see the ballroom filling up with people. 500 guests, Richard had said. CEOs and investors, politicians and celebrities. People who went to symphonies and operas. People who knew the difference between good music and great music. What was he thinking? He was a janitor who hadn't performed in 20 years. These people would see right through him. They'd wonder why they were wasting their time listening to some nobody. "Daddy?" Lucy's voice cut through his spiral of anxiety. She was sitting in the front row, wearing a beautiful new dress that Richard's secretary had helped them pick out. "You're going to be amazing." "I know it." Next to her sat Richard, looking proud and nervous himself. He gave Daniel a thumbs up. On Lucy's other side was Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor who'd agreed to sit with Lucy during the performance. Even some of Daniel's co-workers from the Employee Relations Department had come, wanting to support him. The lights dimmed. Someone was introducing him, but Daniel barely heard the words. Something about hidden talent, about how music can be found in unexpected places, about keeping an open mind. Then the spotlight hit him, bright and hot, and suddenly he was walking onto the stage. The piano waiting for him wasn't the one from the atrium. Richard had rented a concert grand for the occasion, a magnificent instrument that probably cost more than Daniel's car. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the sea of faces. His heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Then his eyes found Lucy. She was sitting on the edge of her seat, her face full of absolute belief in him. And suddenly the fear didn't matter. The 500 strangers didn't matter. He was playing for her. For the little girl who'd asked for a piano. For the daughter who deserved to see her father be brave. Daniel took a deep breath and began to play. He started with the Chopin Nocturne, the piece that had started everything that night in the atrium. His fingers found the keys like greeting old friends. The nervousness melted away as the music took over. This was where he belonged. This was who he was underneath all the years of hiding and surviving. The ballroom was silent except for the piano. Daniel played with his eyes closed, pouring everything into the music. The grief of losing his father, the loneliness of being a single parent, the quiet desperation of working nights, but also the hope, the gratitude, the overwhelming love he felt for his daughter. All of it flowed through his fingers into the room. When the Chopin ended, he transitioned seamlessly into Debussy's Clair de Lune, the moonlight piece, delicate and dreaming. He'd played this for his mother when he was young, before she passed away. He played it now for all the people who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Then for his final piece, Daniel played something completely different. Something he'd written himself during the past 5 weeks. He'd been sitting with Lucy one evening, teaching her a simple melody, when inspiration struck. He'd stayed up all night composing, the music pouring out of him like water from a burst dam. He called it Lucy's Song, though he didn't announce the title. It started soft and sweet like a lullaby. Then it grew more complex, representing all the challenges they'd faced together. The difficult moments, the struggles, the times when Daniel didn't know how they'd make it through. But the melody always came back to that simple, sweet theme, because no matter what happened, they had each other, and that was enough. That had always been enough. As Daniel played the final notes, he opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. She had tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, the biggest, brightest smile he'd ever seen. The room exploded into applause. People were standing, clapping, some of them crying. Daniel stood up from the piano, overwhelmed. He'd forgotten what this felt like. The connection between performer and audience. The way music could reach into people's hearts and touch something they didn't know was there. Richard was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone. The CEO's face was wet with tears again, but he didn't care who saw. Next to him, Lucy was jumping up and down, so proud she looked like she might burst. Daniel walked off the stage, and immediately Lucy ran to him. He scooped her up in his arms, holding her tight. "You did it, Daddy. You were perfect." "I did it for you, sweetheart." All of it. Richard approached them, his hand extended. But when Daniel went to shake it, Richard pulled him into a hug instead. "Thank you," the older man whispered. "Thank you for reminding me what matters." The rest of the evening was a blur of congratulations. Strangers approached Daniel asking about his background, wanting to know where he'd trained. A few offered him opportunities, private events, small concerts, teaching positions. Daniel took their cards, still dazed by how much his life had changed, but the moment that stuck with him happened near the end of the night. A young woman approached him nervously. She looked about 25, dressed in a catering uniform. "Excuse me, Mr. Chen? I just wanted to say, I'm working my way through college. Business degree. But I really love to paint. I'm always too scared to show anyone my work, thinking it's not practical, that it won't lead anywhere. But watching you tonight, it made me think maybe I shouldn't give up on it. Maybe it's okay to honor the things that make us who we are." Daniel felt his throat get tight. "Don't give up on it," he told her. "Whatever you do, don't give up on the things that matter to you. Life will try to make you practical. It'll give you 1,000 reasons to quit. But those dreams, those gifts, they're part of your soul. And you can't be truly happy if you bury them forever." She smiled, tears in her eyes, and thanked him before walking away. Richard had overheard the conversation. "That's why I wanted you to play tonight. Not just for the investors or the publicity, but for people like her, people who need permission to be themselves." 6 months later, Daniel was enrolled part-time at the state university, working toward his music degree. He still worked in employee relations, and he discovered he had a talent for it, recognizing potential in people that others overlooked. Lucy was taking piano lessons now, progressing faster than her teacher expected. She had her father's gift. Richard had changed too. He'd started reaching out to his own children, really reaching out. It was awkward at first, years of distance hard to bridge, but slowly, carefully they were rebuilding something. He'd even started playing piano again himself, finding a piece in it he'd forgotten existed. The company had changed as well. Inspired by Daniel's story, Richard created a program for supporting employees' hidden talents and deferred dreams. They offered scholarships, flexible scheduling, mentorship. The program was called Second Chances, and it had already helped dozens of people pursue education or passions they'd put aside. Daniel still cleaned sometimes, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. There was something meditative about it, something grounding. It reminded him where he'd been and how far he'd come. But more than that, it reminded him that no job was beneath dignity. That worth wasn't measured by titles or salaries. One evening, as Daniel practiced in the atrium with Lucy beside him, he thought about that night Brad had challenged him to play. What had seemed like the worst moment, being mocked, being put on the spot, had actually been the best thing that could have happened. Sometimes life's biggest gifts came wrapped in unexpected packages. Lucy played a scale, still learning, still practicing, but she was getting better every day. And watching her, Daniel realized something profound. He hadn't just reclaimed his own dream. He'd passed it on. He'd given his daughter permission to believe that beautiful things were possible, even when life was hard. Especially when life was hard. The piano in the atrium wasn't just furniture anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that talent exists everywhere, often in the last places people think to look, and that sometimes the most successful thing you can do is recognize the light in someone else and help them shine. Daniel closed his eyes and played. His daughter beside him, the future stretching out ahead of them, full of music and possibility and hope. They stood up, and Richard extended his hand. Daniel shook it, still feeling like he was in a dream. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. "Thank you," Daniel said. "I don't know how to thank you enough." "Play at that gala," Richard said. "Play the way you played tonight. That's all the thanks I need."